Although the section's entitled Web Interfaces, I'm not going to actually talk about PHP, Ruby or any other language in too much detail. Instead, I'm going to talk about the architecture of the web environment. Within traditional web development, people will either traditionally fall into one of two categories. They will class themselves as either being a front-end developer or a back-end developer. Front-end developers typically focus on CSS, JavaScript, while back-end developers will typically focus on PHP, Ruby, and the databases, so MySQL in this case. But people very often forget that PHP, Ruby, those back-end languages are actually front-end languages for databases. And therefore websites as a whole can be considered user interfaces for databases. It's important to understand that if you're creating a web-based application which will store details and be interactive in some way, that you acknowledge the fact that the website is just a user interface for the database. Because this will help you understand the proper context to view the website in. Its purpose is to act as the user interface to the database, rather than giving your users direct access to your database. Because every website is different, finding the correct balance of where you actually store the queries necessary to run the database is something that you'll need to figure out according to the specific framework that you're using for your website. Some frameworks will push all of the queries down into the database itself, using stored functions, views, and other storage methods, while some other frameworks will contain all of the code for queries within the framework itself. Which is the correct approach depends on how the framework is using the database, and there are costs in terms of resource utilization for both approaches, and these costs can often have a deciding factor as to which approach is eventually taken. So by that I mean if your architecture includes things like caching data which is returned from database, it's often preferable to keep all of the code relating to the database within the database itself in the form of functions, procedures, as we've talked about. If you're not caching data from your database, and especially if your website is on the smaller side of things, with maybe only 100 daily users, it may be preferable to keep all of your code within your PHP or Ruby environment, and execute and manipulate all of the code from within PHP or Ruby itself. This does obviously, however, have security implications, because so much more of your database is available to obviously your web server in order for it to be able to perform those queries. Whereas if you were to bolt down all of the access to those functions to specific users, the functions themselves could actually manipulate all of the tables for you, rather than your website having to manipulate every individual table itself. So there are big questions about how you actually configure your website and which approach you take, whether you keep all of your queries within MySQL within the database itself, or whether you move them into your programming environment. And these are just things to consider.